This is Catholic Conversations. We're coming to you today with a kind of an emergency prayer request. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, your church, they're going to have a General Conference Executive Committee to decide if they're going to bring up in the General Conference to reestablish the verbiage that you have for your abortion guidelines. And what we're requesting is to please call the conference office, call your General Conference, and urge them to vote in a pro-life manner. Try to get them to make non-ambiguous language. Right now,
so that the Adventist hospitals don't do abortions on demand, or even abortions at all.
Right.
So. Well, this vote that your church is doing is putting you guys directly in the middle of the Revelation 18 prophecy.
If you watch television or internet, the top of the list of topics besides the president is about moral issues.
Right, that's right.
About abortion, about contraception, and trans and sexual disorientation of some sort.
And we're going to go back to Genesis in order to explain to you why we're making that claim.
There are two very specific commands that God gave, but they're not the ones that you might think they were or are. And they were given almost the very first thing. So I'll read first, and then we'll talk about it.
It's Genesis 1, what?
27 and 28. Okay. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Absolutely interesting, especially when you look at our era and things that are going on right now. Right. Be fruitful and multiply. This, from the very beginning, is part of the natural law.
It just happens naturally. If you make love, you may very well have a child. That's the way God,
if God blesses
set
you for
it
that,
up
yes.
in the natural law of science.
That's right.
And these two things that Arthur read are the very first two commandments for humans.
And this is even before the end of creation.
That's right. Before the Sabbath institution,
right.
We get those two, and people don't realize when God says do something, it's a commandment.
It's a commandment.
It's a commandment. And so he said,
that's right.
Be fruitful and multiply. And he said, be the king, the ruler of the world, subdue it. Have dominion over the earth.
He didn't just say remember it. He said go do this. Fill the earth.
That's right.
Which is excellent for babies especially. So what would be the inverse of that? It would be disobedience. When you look at what Satan did, just compare the two. You have God on one side, and God said, fill the earth, be fruitful and multiply, and rule over the earth. Obviously, a Christian especially is going to, when we say rule over the earth, it's not with an iron fist, We're talking about being responsible.
Right, taking care
of the earth.
Right. Don't pollute.
But we're not just gardeners. God made Adam in his lineage. He made him kingship until Satan shows up and offers him death, lying and death. And so he had these two things that he had to choose from, and he chose to go with the lie.
That you shall be like God.
Exactly, which was a lie at that time for sure. And so what did this do? Well, one, that it made it, women are going to have pain when they give birth, it may be harder to even conceive. We don't know everything that it affected, but we know those for sure. And man is no longer, he's going to have to go out and toil now. So it gives the impression that he wouldn't have had to toil for food if he wouldn't have accepted, Satan's lie.
Yeah, the first 2 commandments have a correlation to the penalties that Adam and Eve got after the fall. So the first penalty, which was, we as Catholics believe that it was penances, because it helps to, it's helping you to restore. In other words, it's a restorative. It's not just punishment, but it's a restorative thing. And so the penalty for a woman was about hardship in conception and birth. And the penalty for man was hardship as he ruled the earth, hardship as he was toiling on the earth.
From the very, very beginning, Satan attacked life. Satan brings lies and death, always. And God brings truth, light, and life, always. So, very interesting. So, this brings us through history up to Noah. Noah was told the exact same thing. He said, be fruitful. God told Noah, be fruitful, and you and your sons, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Which is kind of like...
He was those 2 commandments were repeated to Noah. And
to do
he was
these
supposed
things.
to
Correct.
take responsibility over the earth.
Right.
So
then we come up to Abraham. Abraham's 99 years old, and God's telling him he's going to have a son, and he thought that was kind of Abraham thought that was kind of humorous, but it must have been in a respectful way because he wasn't struck dead. So he bore at 100 years old his son, and he was given the promise and the covenant that his son would produce as many lineage for him as the stars of the sky. So he promised truth, and he promised lineage, he promised children to
And he said,
to Abraham.
I'm going to give you a land. He's going to give a kingdom to Abraham in the promised land.
Right.
And that was to his children.
Right. So then we come to Moses in Deuteronomy. Moses this is interesting. I'm going to read 2 lines. I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. So choose life so that you and your descendants may live. It sounds a little familiar. It sounds like the Garden of Eden.
Right.
Just like when they said, okay, you can choose to obey God and have life, or you can choose to do what Satan is lying to you about, which is choosing death.
Right before Moses died, he had taken the children through the desert. They were about to grasp that promise that God had made to Abraham, and walk in and take over the promised land.
Right.
And Moses was reminding him,
right.
Look, this is about you and your children living. Keep my commandments, keep those, and you and your children will live.
And it brings life. It brings life. The Lord keeps on going over and over and over again about listen to me and life will be produced. So then we get to King David. It's interesting, you read through several things that King David has written in the Psalms, and one of the things he says is, he's speaking to God, he said, you knew me before I was even formed in the womb, in his secret place in the womb, before even his mother even knew.
I believe that's Psalms 139.
So his covenant was his seed would rule. And basically the same thing as Abraham. He had the blessing, so even I wouldn't say better, but that's one of Christ's titles, is the Son of David. So this whole lineage started there with David. And
again, the kingdom, this idea of the promise is a kingdom for your children.
Yes.
The first two commandments are even through David. You know, they're actually reaching its greatest fulfillment through David, which we'll speak about in a minute.
So to sum up, from the very first, God is about life. Even before he's done with creation, he gives us a directive, a command that has never been withdrawn. Be fruitful and multiply, and go rule the earth. You see this all the way up to this point in time with King David and beyond, is God is constantly wanting to bless us with our lineage.
Be fruitful and multiply was a command. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Because
Right.
there's a story in the Old Testament that talks about the penalty of not producing.
Sure.
You know
The story of Onan. Onan had a brother that ended up not being a very good guy and was struck down by God. And God told Onan, you go to your sister-in-law and you have children with her for the lineage of your brother, and they would belong to her and be her lineage. They wouldn't even be considered his children, but that was his.
Even for that rotten brother.
Instead of having children with her, he spilled his seed on the ground, and he was struck dead as well. You might say he was struck dead because
He disobeyed.
He disobeyed.
When he decided he
Right.
was not going to have
Right.
give his brother a lineage, you know, that he was going
Right.
to sleep with his wife but not
Right, but the
give her
penalty
children.
for that, there was actually a specific penalty for that in the Jewish culture, and that was she was to take off one of his sandals and spit in his face in public. And one, she was humiliated because he wouldn't have children with her, and he was humiliated now because he had done this in front of everybody. So that was the penalty, though. It wasn't the death penalty. So you have to ask, so why did...
Well, but we need to be very clear that he wasn't ever supposed to even pretend to sleep with her. In other words, he was
Right.
supposed to go, I'm not interested, goodbye.
Right.
But the sin came in because he said he was going to. He took her and then he spilled the seed.
Contracepted, essentially.
He contracepted,
He
right.
contracepted. So that is the horrible, bitter story of
And-
Onan, and shows the importance of not contracepting
Right.
and blocking the lineage that God's in charge of.
So
The new covenant did not abrogate or change or replace the first two commandments given at creation. They were still there. Go forth and multiply, have children, establish your kingdom. In fact, Christ's parable of the mustard seed, think about this. He could have picked anything. Christ picked the mustard seed. The Bible even says the tiniest seed in the garden.
Mm-hmm.
But look at what happens with it, okay? It gets to be the largest, some Bibles say tree, but I've never seen a mustard plant, but I guess it can grow fairly large, big enough for birds to go into.
Right. That's what it says.
Think about what the statement it's making is. That's what God's kingdom is. It gets bigger and it grows. How is it going to grow if you're constantly stopping and cutting off your lineage?
Right.
You can't do that. That is not our duty. That is God's duty to decide how big that bush gets.
In fact, the new covenant champions the idea of fertility and having kids. Christ's great commission to his church is actually a reflection of life that's brought forth from the love, because the new covenant is Christ and his church. Mm-hmm. And the Christ in his church is reflected in the family. Mm-hmm. And so when Christ says, go forth and bring in people all over the world, we're opening this covenant up to the entire world. That is reflective of what the family is supposed to do as man and wife, bring forth fruit.
That's right.
One is spiritual fruit, one is actual
That's
children.
Right. So we go now to the new covenant church and show how it is the fulfillment. It's the fulfillment of the second commandment of creation, to subdue and rule the earth. And we will show how the early church took the first commandment, to be fruitful and multiply, as a sacred duty of God. This is not new. Contraception didn't come in until very recently.
As far as the
legality of it, and looked at in society as some option.
Right, especially for married people.
Right.
So the church in the first century, at the time of Christ, what's called the apostolic age, was firmly against contraception and abortion. And we know this because the early church writers and leaders left a great paper trail. And even before a lot of the New Testament was even written, there were people that went around and wrote down what the apostles were teaching. And so we have what's called the Didache, and it is a first century document, not necessarily written by the apostles themselves, but written by people of that time that were going and listening to them. And so in the second chapter of the Didache, it says, it's recording the verbiage of the apostles, and it says, "You shall not practice magic, you shall not practice witchcraft, you shall not murder a child by abortion, nor kill a child that which is begotten." And that was a fairly routine. Actually, contraception and abortion, potions and stuff, at that time could be very, very dangerous. And so the Romans practiced infanticide because it was less destructive to the woman. And so if the Roman male, the head of the household, the patriarch, he had a child by his wife, they could look at the baby and the dad could decide, okay, this baby's not good enough, it's a girl, it's a whatever it is, they're going to expose it or just leave it to die. So they could legally practice infanticide. The early church was, and that's why they talked a lot about it. That's why we have several existing documents that talk about this. At that time, it was very well known that witchcraft by that time, especially in Rome, witchcraft was kind of put down. In other words, they were enlightened. They were people of law. They had doctors and stuff like this. So witchcraft had kind of faded, but there was some witchcraft left, the sorcerers. And the main thing that they produced were potions for fertility purposes, for contraception and abortion. And the reason being is that potions for contraception and abortion were so dangerous that even though many of the doctors of that time would go home and say, okay, here, women, if you just have to have an abortion, here, go home and do this. It was rare for a doctor to actually be involved in the process of contraception and abortion. And so a lot of women in desperation would go to the sorcerers, the magicians. This is widely known, and we'll source this at the end. So we're going to stay in the first century. The Epistle of Barnabas. Barnabas was the companion of Paul, and he is said to have written a work, but they couldn't verify it in the early church. So it was not included in the Gospels, but it was very widely read among Christians. It said abortion is prohibited. At the time that the apostles were writing their Gospels and their letters to the church. So now we go to John. John wrote one of the Gospels, the Gospel of John, and he wrote some letters to churches. But then when he was on the island of Patmos, and they believe that this was right at the turn of the first century to the second century, the word that John used when he spoke about sorcery and magicians. You see, the Greek had several words.
Now, this is the same sorcery that was spoken about in Rome, in the
Right.
city of Rome that
Right.
everybody used. Okay.
Right. Well, and Greek had several words for it. Like we have magia, which that's the word that the early Christian writers used for the Magi.
Magician, yeah.
Yeah, and I think
yeah.
in Matthew, or maybe it was Luke, they spoke about the three Magi. And then there was Simon Magnus and Elmas. And Acts 8 and in Acts 13:6, that word magus or mageia was used to represent the magicians of that day. And that word was available, and then there was another one, pererogos, and it is talked about in Acts 19:19, where they're discussing the Christians giving up sorcery, and they burned their sorcery scrolls.
And you have to think about this. Why would they want? What difference does it make if you're doing sleight of hand or doing card tricks? No, this is serious.
Right.
Serious stuff that they're doing.
Right. But John uses a different word when he writes Revelation. And the Greek word that he uses for sorcery or witchcraft is translated pharmakeia. And it means distributor of medicines, potions, or herbs. And again, in the first century, this was specifically used for potions of contraception and abortion.
Now, we're not saying that they didn't make potions for a stomach ache or something.
Yeah, but you went to a doctor.
Right, but they did abortive practices so much that most of their practice is when they were referred to, that's the first thing most people thought of, was this the abortive acts that they did with this pharmakeia.
And it's interesting that Paul uses it in Galatians 5:20. Revelation 18 is the passage in the Bible that talks about the fall of Babylon. Now, it's got parallel passages in the Old Testament, Isaiah 47 and Jeremiah 51. And this is in the context of the last days. This is what Adventists believe is going to happen right before the Lord comes. Doug Batchelor just put out a video where he's talking about the Pope and the climate change stuff, and he uses this. So it's a very big text that tells about why the whore of Babylon fell. What is this what happened? And so we're going to go to Revelation 18:23, and I'm going to just read it. And the light of a candle shall shine no more in thee. This is Babylon. And the voice of the bridegroom and the bride shall be heard no more at all in thee. For thy merchants were the great men of the earth. That's a big point. The merchants were the great men of the earth, as opposed to kings and opposed to emperors and dynasties. These were merchants. That sounds pretty close to where we are right now. It says, the merchants were the great men of the earth, for by thy sorceries were all nations deceived. Okay, so this is a big deal. All nations were deceived by this sorcery. What could possibly be this sorcery? John doesn't use magos, and he doesn't use any of the other Greek words for magic. He specifically uses pharmakeia. And pharmakeia means contraception and abortion, potions. Okay, now think about this. Let's put that in. Let's reread this. For there were great men of the earth. We had great men like George Soros and great men like Bill and Melinda Gates and the Rockefeller and the Ford Foundation and all these great men of the earth. For by their use and promotion of contraception and abortion, all nations were deceived. We're just going to read one more text that John uses, which I think is really important. This is Revelation 22:15. This is 7 verses from the end of the Bible. This is the last thing that John is telling the world about, warning the world about, who is not going to be in heaven. And he gives a list. For without the gates of the kingdom are the dogs, which are bad men, sorcerers, pharmakon, which those are the people who distribute drugs again that keep fertility from happening, contraception and abortion, whoremongers, murderers, idolaters, and whosoever loveth and maketh a lie. I mean, we've got to take this very seriously. He's warning against those that sell contraception or promote it. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of, I'm going to have, again, at the end, we're going to put the sources, but it's not just the Christians that talked about this. The pagans also knew pharmakeia was for abortion and contraception. The first century Plutarch in Parallel Lives used it, the word pharmakeia, and it specifically referred to contraception and abortion. In a famous book on gynecology in the first century by the Dr. Serrano, refers specifically to pharmakeia as potions distributed by magicians that cause infertility and abortion.
And like we said, this is something that they do so often that is thought of first when you talk about pharmakeia.
In other words,
pharmakeia.
They didn't even say, "Oh, well, among the things." They said, "No, this is specifically referring to that."
Distributed Tums or something. No, this is toxic substances that made specifically for contraception.
And again, we're going to put the sources, and there are lots. The second century was that spoke about the church being against contraception and abortion. There were works such as Clement of Alexandria, the early second century, Apocalypse of Peter, people like Tertullian, Hippolytus, Origen, Cyprian, all reported how the Christians of their time despised even the idea of abortion. Okay, now we're going to jump from John, the Revelation of John, and a lot of people believe that that was for the early Christians, that Revelation was basically done by the 3rd or 4th century. But we know that there are a lot of Christians out there that believe it's for the last day. And so now we're going to go all the way to today and say, okay, if Revelation is for today, this works in perfectly. My husband's going to explain just exactly how today's climate change has to do with Revelation 18.
We're going to show you in a minute here some things that are happening currently, what they expect human beings to do. So remember, in the very beginning, God said, go be fruitful and multiply and rule the earth, okay? Subdue it, be in charge of it, garden it, take care of it, be a good steward of the earth, correct? Well, the global warmists are pushing now for not to have children at all. The climate people are using abortion to say if you really care about the earth, then you need to contracept and you need abortions for everybody in every country. They're pushing for that. And if anybody's listened to the Democratic debates, that's a big, huge thing right now. Everybody's seeing who can up the ante. Well, I'm gonna push for free contraception, or one of them is pushing to open up all countries for free contraception and free abortion for everything. So it's a big deal. So that's how it's connected. So now we're going to show you some video clips of current things that happened either this week, this month, this year, very recently, and they're hammering on this global crisis that they call it, global warming, and we'll show you that right now.
We have gone forth and multiplied, but now we have to stop.
Is it okay to still have children? And
people are dying. Farms, towns that will never be recovered and never come back.
You're getting people to sign a pledge, basically saying that they will not have children.
I don't really have a lot of hope for the future, and so that feeling of fear is where the pledge came from. My life plan was always to have 2 kids, and so it really hurts making this decision because it's
Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
150 countries around the world to protest the climate change situation in what might be the largest environmental protest in history.
Billions of people in the streets around the world calling for action on climate change. That includes, you are looking at an incredible worldwide set of protests.
When we're talking about the climate crisis, we are talking about a matter of whether or not there will be a future.
This is a moral challenge, and it's up to us to do something about it.
Do you think that might resonate with some people? There's a small group of people who still deny the science.
We should open up every door we can find to get toward action on this issue.
If the history of the last 2 centuries was one of unbridled growth, the history of the coming century may well be the choice we make as a species. These are the arguments that will be resolved in one way or another by our children's generation, the generation that will come into the world of 10 billion.
And the Mexico City Agreement, which denies American aid to those organizations around the world that allow women to have abortions, to me is totally absurd.
You know, folks have been talking about population control for a really long time.
Right.
I don't know that people have talked about it under the rubric of climate change. You're hearing the backlash.
Population one of the biggest issues in the world right now?
It's actually not. Anytime you're talking about population control, if you're a pro-life person, it starts sounding alarms, because again, like in China, they enacted a one-child policy, and now men outnumber women by 70 million in China and India. This dystopian, hellhole, nightmarish hellscape that Democrats are putting out, that climate change is just going to end everything, to the fact that we're going to have population control in this country, seems very extreme.
What I'm saying is that women around the world, just like in this country, should have access to family planning, which includes abortion.
Right, but AOC says we shouldn't have children anymore for climate change. That is scary to people.
Think about all the women in Ireland who for years, they just wanted birth control because they live in a Catholic country that said you cannot have it. They were having an insane amount of children.
I mean, the population's going to have to stop growing at some point, so why not stop now? Instead of wishing that some invention or technology will save us that doesn't even exist yet, we're not even sure works. So for everyone to have quality of life, the number of humans on Earth needs to go down. Let's be part of the solution and choose from now on to bring forth no more than one child ourselves. Thank you.
Yes, you heard Whoopi Goldberg correctly. What exactly is an insane amount of children? I want a number, because she throws that out like it is a scientific...
Like they're having 30. This is what Whoopi doesn't understand, is when you put what is the average woman's fertility of the world, and then you compare it to Ireland. Ireland is always under it. In 1950, they were having, I think, 4.5 or 5 kids per family, which was normal in 1950. And now the Ireland and America, we're now not having enough children for replacement.
Right.
So,
and a lot of countries are running into that problem because of the lie of this globalist lie that, oh no, what are we going to do?
Right.
There's too many people in the world.
Right. Babies. In 1 year, there's like 50 million babies aborted every year worldwide. There has been, they've projected, or the numbers, they've run the numbers, and they said it's been over 1 billion in the last century of children being aborted by their mothers. And that has made the mother's womb the most dangerous place on the face of the earth, because 1 out of 4 babies today are aborted. 25%. I mean, there's never a time in history that kind of statistic for fatalities. I'm not even sure war would have 25% of its people dying. But the world, it says in Romans, someplace in Romans, it says that the earth is crying out because of the sins it's having. You know, even the earth is going to cry out over this. And so I think that's what's happening. I think it's a spiritual, earth is trembling and shaking because of it.
So, no matter what the last days are like, no matter what interpretation you bring to the last day prophecy, characters such as the Antichrist, the Whore of Babylon, and the beasts, what we do know and what we see as a continuous theme throughout the Bible and history is that Satan's foremost attack has always been against life. Satan hates God and wants to kill anything in his likeness, and that is man.
Swedish professor saying that we can eat dead people, but that's not fast enough. We got to start eating babies. Just stopping having babies is not enough. We need to eat the babies.
The worldwide climate change crisis is nothing more than Satan understanding that in the last days the earth will groan under the weight of sin, especially the sin of the blood of the innocent. And Satan wants to make sure, rather than man stop the bloodshed, mankind will do just what caused the problem in the first place.
Right.
Stop life. The global reaction to the earth's groaning is taking it right into the middle of Gaia worship or earth worship. And that is reversing the commandments of God for man to subdue the earth as its ruler and making the earth and nature rule man instead. This hatred of man by Satan is using this crisis in order to depopulate the earth of children of God, and again reversing the very first commandment of God, which is bring forth children, be fruitful. Is it possible that this hatred of life being forced on the whole world through contraception and abortion to control the population will be the great last day deception? Is it possible that the great test of our time is whether we will be obedient to the first two commandments given to man at creation? Is it possible that the last day prophecy could be that simple and clear?
Let's stop and have a prayer for the SDA Church right now, and then we'll close.
Holy Father in heaven, we reach out to you and we lift up the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the name of Jesus.
Amen.
That their eyes are open, their ears are open to your voice of life and truth, and that their hearts are moved in this meeting that they're going to have, that they do bring this up, the guidelines for abortion, in their general conference, and they vote for non-ambiguous, strong pro-life guidelines that lift you up and build up the church. This we ask in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thank you for listening. I'm Arthur, and this is my wife, Teresa. We love you, and God bless you.
Keep watching. We're going to get to some topics you guys will be super interested soon, like the Sabbath.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.